Good morning and welcome to today's session of Library Adventures Live. Now this morning I'm talking to the heroic Phil Earle, and you're in for a treat because Phil is engaging and very inspiring. He's a true advocate for reading and for writing and the power of stories. And I read about him. Phil manages to do the impossible. He manages to make each individual child feel as though themselves they are writers, which I think is quite an accolade. I think that's pretty good. Now, as always, if you have any questions for Phil, please type them into the chat box because we'd love to hear from you. And there'll be a bit at the end of Phil's bit where we can ask the questions. Now, before we talk to Phil, I'd like to talk just a little bit about last week's session. So our last week's session. It was Tuesday the 24th, and it was Tara Elgier, and Tara joined us fresh from the launch of her engaging new picture book. It's called Just Like Grandpa Jazz. A book explores themes of intergenerational relationships, about race and about dual heritage, and it's aimed at 4 to 7-year-olds. Now, if you'd like to see that or any of the other sessions that we've done in the past, please visit our website, and I'll just go to our banners to find the website for you. There we go. That's kirkleyslibraries.co.uk/lal. There you'll be able to see not only last week's session, but all the exciting sessions that we've got planned for the future. Now, back to today. Phil was last with us in Kirkleys in November. He came to talk, November of last year, he came to talk about his fabulous book then, When the Sky Falls, which is this one. I can never hold these up straight, but I think it's about there. It was published by Anderson Press in 2021, and it was the winner of Books Are My Bag Reader's Choice Award and the Times Children's Book of the Year. And it was also shortlisted, which we are very excited about. It was shortlisted for this year's Yoto Carnegie Greenaway Awards. Now, Phil's given talks to groups as small as 6 and as big as 800 plus. He's a very entertaining speaker. So I'm going to leave Phil to tell you all about himself and about his books, and his belief that the simplest, most mundane events in life can spark a new adventure. He believes there is wonderful drama in our everyday lives waiting for us to write about. And I think that's a great place to bring Phil into the studio. Hi, Phil.
Morning, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I believe you've written 21 books so far. Is that right?
22 now.
2 and climbing.
Yeah.
And they're all for different age groups. They aren't all middle grade, are they?
No, I've done early sort of chapter books for young readers, age 5, 6, 7, and then I've done middle grade, and I've done books for teenagers as well.
What I wanted to ask you about was, I believe Supernan is the 7th book for Barrington Stokes. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And you didn't read novels as a kid, and neither did I. So can I ask you what advice you would give to reluctant readers with dyslexia, or parents of children who are reluctant readers, to get them more involved in reading?
I think it's just about finding that one right story. It's about tapping into that young person's passion. Do you know what I mean? For me, it was footy, as a kid. So comics was the way in for me. I'll talk about it more in the session. But the lovely thing is reading doesn't have to be this. You know what I mean? It's like attitudes have changed, thankfully. And reading can be lots of different things. And you don't even have to read with your eyes, for goodness sake. You can read with your ears. Or pretty much any story you want to absorb these days, you can download and listen to it, or borrow it as an audio book from libraries. So it's about tapping into that right story. It's about.
I love that clip for libraries. Thank you very much for the plug for libraries.
My pleasure. Well, there's so much snobbery around reading. There's so much snobbery about not proper reading, not reading the right kind of books, the right kind of stories, and it makes me cross because there's no such thing as proper reading. There's only reading, and don't matter what it is. It can be a phone bill for all I care. It's just about escaping outside of your own life, living a life, engaging in a story that isn't your own, Do you know what I mean?
I
Escaping
do.
your
I
own
do.
hum.
I always used to say, I don't care what you're reading, it can be a cornflake packet as long as you're reading something.
Aye,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
So, on that note, I know you've got an exciting session planned for us. I'm just going to hand over to you, and then I'll come back at the end and we'll have some questions, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
See you in a bit. So, it's very nice to spend a bit of time with you today. Thank you for having me. I am going to tell you about this weird thing that's happened to me in my life, which is that I have become a writer, but I don't really know how it's happened. Growing up, I had no aspirations to write. Growing up, my single aspiration in life was to be a footballer. I grew up in the magnificent city of Hull. And so the only football team I ever had eyes for were the mighty Hull City, the Tigers. And if you think they're bad now, if you're laughing now at my aspirations, you should have seen how bad we were when I was a kid. We were dreadful. But I desperately wanted to play footy, but then something awful happened to me when I was about 14. My life was changed forever by the most sickening addiction known to man, one that I've never truly kicked, no matter how hard I've tried. And that addiction is for the beautiful frazzle. Now, teachers, we will get on to reading in a minute, but first of all, we need to talk about the salty snacks, because the frazzle is without a doubt the greatest snack ever known. There's only one problem with this bag, apart from the fact that it's empty. Of course, it's empty because it's mine. It's not big enough. What is the point in a bag of crisps that is that small when it could be like 3 times the size? The only place I've ever been where they sell proper size bags of Frazzles is Wales for some reason. You get like a proper big munch bag. Amazing. I bought every single pack I could. But these ruined my football career, because by the time I was 14, I was probably on, I don't know, a good dozen bags a day. And by that point, my fitness levels had dropped to a new low. I was so full of salt. I couldn't run up and down a football pitch anymore. Couldn't even run a bath without getting out of breath. So as a result, the mighty Hull City never came calling, and my football career was over. But what I did still have was football in other senses. But I didn't think I was a reader, largely because of the way that my teachers talked to me about reading. Teachers were very different human beings then. When I was at school, a teacher literally would say to us, right, Phil, if you want to be classed as a reader, it's got to look like this. It's got to be a novel. It's got to be at least 300 pages long. And when you open it up inside, it's got to look like that. I don't want to see any pictures, Phil. No pictures allowed. It's got to be at least 300 pages long, and preferably it should have been written before the year 1900, because that's when all the good stuff was written. And that was it for me. I thought I was stuffed. I thought, well, I can't read that. I always loved the idea of novels. I like going into bookshops and libraries with my mum. I like the way books looked. I like the way they felt. But the wall of words that I would find inside, I just used to find too intimidating. So as a result, I didn't read novels. But actually, I was always a reader. And this is my point to you today. We are all readers. It doesn't matter what you're reading. Reading doesn't have to be encapsulated by the novel. For me, age 10, the thing that made a difference to my reading life was a comic. Every Monday, it wasn't dog-eared like this is, but this beautiful comic used to come through our letterbox. This is Roy of the Rovers. You can see on the date there, 12th of December 1981. That came through our letterbox when I was 7 years old. Cost 16p. 16p. You can't even get half a bag of Frazzles for that now. But this was heaven for me, because when I opened it up, it didn't look like any other sort of reading that I'd done. Because when I opened it, I wasn't confronted by a wall of words. I was confronted by this beautiful marriage of words and pictures together on the page. And this was a story that I could get on board with. This was a story that didn't scare me, didn't intimidate me. And even though it was only 32 pages long, I would read this hungrily, because for me, it was everything that was exciting about reading it. It allowed me to escape outside of my own life, to pretend that I was this professional footballer. But if I'd taken this into school, my teachers would basically have laughed at me. They would have said, well, Phil, comics are for little ones. That's not proper reading. Go get yourself a novel. And it makes me cross, Because this, my friends, is absolutely as valid a reading experience as this. It simply is. And it doesn't matter that there's pictures and words together on the page. This is still proper reading. Proper reading isn't about when a book was written or how many pages it's got or how many words are on every page or how serious the book is. Proper reading is about how a book makes you feel. As long as what you're reading is making you feel something, that is the only thing that matters. And that's what I'd love you to remember from this session. The only problem I ever had with Roy the Rover's comic was the fact that when it arrived, I never got to read it quickly because I, like many of you, have an older brother. Now, if you have an older brother or an older sister, you'll know that they're put on this planet for one reason alone, which is to make your life a misery, a fresh hell every day. Older brothers and sisters are terrible, awful human beings. And my brother was no different because when I was sort of 10, that comic used to get delivered and my brother used to get to it first. And he would literally push me to the floor and kick me in the ribs and leave me there battered and bruised. And I wanted that comic more than anything, but he wouldn't let me read it. Not until the next one had arrived the next week, and that was the old comic. He used to read it 150,000 times. He'd turn it upside down and pretend to read it. He'd even take scissors and cut panels out of it so I couldn't read it properly. He's a terrible human being. So yeah, if you're a big brother or a big sister, play nicely, please. So I went through my teenage years, I guess, not thinking I was really a reader, but I was, because I had Roy the Rovers and I had Batman and I had Spider-Man, I had the Hulk and the Avengers and Daredevil. And that's the beautiful thing. Reading can take on many forms. As I mentioned earlier, you don't even have to read with your eyes. You can read with your ears. Two of my children live with dyslexia, which means that they're not able really to read easily. When they do, words move about on the page for them. So as a result, we can encourage them to read with their ears. They can download stories. Any story that you want to read, you can pretty much download it and listen to it. And that's still reading. You're still concentrating. You're still taking that story in. Just because you're not using these things, you're just using different senses. That's all it is. So find that thing that you love to read and read as many of them as you can, I guess. Now, I'd imagine that a lot of you watching today will already be writers. And if that is the case, I take off my hat to you because I wasn't a writer when I was your age. The only writing I did was for all the wrong reasons. When I was about 14, I woke up one morning realizing that there was something else apart from football and frazzles that was important in life. And that other thing was girls. I woke up one day and realized that what I would really like more than anything is a girlfriend. I'd like just one girl to notice us and go, oh, Phil's nice, isn't he? Like, you know, we could go for a burger or cinema or something. And so I thought the way to impress them was to join a band. I joined a band at school. We were called Solidaire. Now, we were either the greatest band ever or the worst. I'll let you decide where we sat on that spectrum. But I was the singer in this band, and I used to write songs. I used to write these beautiful poems, these heartfelt lyrics, rhyming couplets, all about girls and how brilliant they were. Because I thought it would get me a girlfriend. And tell me, do you think that came true? No, of course it didn't come true. And it didn't come true for a reason, because they were terrible. The songs were awful, dreadful, shocking. Your little brothers and sisters, who were probably like 3 or 4, could do better with a big fat wax crayon. And I know that they're terrible because I found my book that I wrote them in a few years ago when I was moving house. I found this old notebook, and inside are my song lyrics. And I'm not going to hold this too close to the screen because I don't want you to be able to read what it says. But these were all my poems that I wrote in the hope of getting me a girlfriend. And strangely enough, it did not come true. And it didn't come true because they were terrible. They were dreadful. They were the worst songs you have ever heard. And as a result, girls didn't want anything to do with me. So if you get one thing from this session today, it's this. Especially young ladies who might be watching this. If a boy comes up to you in the next 10 years and tells you he's written you a song, you need to do one thing, and that's run, like for the hills. Teenage boys are horrible, terrible, cynical human beings. Stay away from them at all costs. I'm really sorry. I've got terrible hay fever today. I just need to blow my nose. Gives me a really itchy nose. It's rubbish. Okay, so I got to the age of like 26 and didn't really think I was a reader because I was still reading comics, but I didn't realize that was proper reading. And I certainly wasn't a writer either. And at the age of 26, I got a job in a bookshop just to pay the bills. And the lady that ran that shop made me work in the children's department. And she said, right, Phil, if you're going to work in this department, you're going to read the books for young people. So when they come into the shop, you can put a book in their hands and say, do you know what? I've read this. It's brilliant. You should give it a try. And she gave me a book, which I promise you, it pretty much changed my life, really. And that book was this. Do you know this book? A lot of you will know this book. I speak in a lot of schools, and schools always seem to study this in year 5 or year 6. And they study it for a very good reason, because it is pretty much, I think, the most perfect book ever written. Let me have a swig of tea. One of the reasons I love this book as a reluctant reader is because, firstly, it's short. Look at it. We're 200 pages long. But it covers over 200 years of history. And it's a drama and a comedy and a western and a crime book and a murder book and a mystery book. And it's got these lizards in it. And when their venom gets into your bloodstream, it makes you die the ugliest death imaginable. It literally has everything. And the second I read that book, it was like a light bulb moment for me. I mean, look, I've got a light bulb above my head. It was like, ping, it went on. And I was like, oh my goodness. Turns out there are actually books out there that I want to read. It just so happened that they weren't books for adults. They were books for people your age. And now I'm 47. And a lot of my reading life is still spent. I still like graphic novels. I still like comics and magazines. And I read an awful lot of children's books. Because children's books are the books that get me excited, because they're the stories that get my heart racing, and they're the books that give me pleasure. And there's only one real reason outside of school to read, and that is for pleasure. So find that book. For me, it was Holes. And what it did was it allowed me to go on and read loads of other books for children. Even though I was in my late 20s, I'd read books by David Almond and Mallory Blackman and Philip Reeve and Philip Ridley and Marcus Zuzat and Essie Hinton and Keith Gray and Michelle Harrison, like loads and loads and loads and loads of books. And it made me realize after a couple of years that I really wanted to be a writer. I wanted to try and write something for children, which left me with a really big question, which was, where on earth was I going to get my ideas from? And that's a big question. Where does a writer get their inspiration from stories from? And the beautiful answer to that question is the fact that they come from everywhere, because we're surrounded by them. We're surrounded by stories every single second of our lives. And the only thing, I promise you, the only thing that's ever potentially going to stop you from spotting stories that you can write down and turn into books is this thing. And a lot of us have them, don't we? We have phones. And if you're like me, and I know your teachers do it as well, so don't deny it, teachers, you walk down the street every day like this, with your head in your phone, and you're texting people or Facebooking people or tweeting or WhatsApping, or some of you are TikToking, apparently. Don't understand it. But if you put your phone in your pocket half an hour every day as you walk down the street, I promise you those stories, they're out there. They're waiting for you to spot and write down. The next time your neighbour leaves for work in the morning, watch them. Now, don't do it from your bedroom window with like a pair of binoculars and a notepad. Police don't like that. I think they call it stalking. But watch your neighbour as they leave for work. Does your neighbour leave for work one morning, dragging behind them a suitcase that looks like it weighs a ton, only to come back half an hour later and the case is now empty? It's now as light as a feather. Think what could have been in that case. Because actually, as a writer, the only question you ever need to ask yourself is a really simple one, and it's 2 words long, and it's what if? What if there was something in that suitcase? What if there was gold? What if there was money? What if there was £1 million? What if there was a kidnapped child, or a drugged animal, or a dead body, or a gun, a bomb? Do you know what I mean? It could be anything. And just by asking that question of what if there was something in that case, you can start the process of writing a story. And for me, the beautiful thing about writing, I can sum up in it's not even 2 words, is it? It's 1 word. It's playtime. Now, when you're at junior school, life is pretty magnificent because you normally have playtime twice a day, maybe once in the morning, once in the afternoon. And when that bell rings, you can run into the playground, especially when you're little. And, when you're in the early years at school, you can go and pretend to be anything you want. You can be a pirate or an astronaut or a sportsman or a ballerina or a thief, whatever you want to be. You can go and pretend to be that person in the playground. Now, when you get to secondary school, it starts to change because they don't call it playtime anymore. They call it break. And then you become an adult. Now, that's when it really stinks because you don't have break or playtime then, because you have these things called jobs. And you have to get these things called jobs because often you have these things called children. And I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're very expensive. And as a result, when you're working, there's no playtime and life becomes quite boring, except for when you're writing. When I'm writing, when I sit at my desk and I open my laptop and I start to write, it literally feels like it's playtime again. It feels like the bell's just rung and I've run into the yard with my coat tied around my neck, pretending to be Batman. Because when I am writing, there's nowhere I can't go. There's nothing I can't do. There's no world I can't create. There's no person I can't pretend to be. And there's no adventure that I can't go on. And they, for me, are 5 great reasons why writing is a beautiful pastime. So think about that. Think about how you can use writing to make your playtime last all day long instead of just 15 minutes in the morning and afternoon. So I love this idea that you can get ideas for stories from everywhere. Let me give you an example. You can, would you believe, get your ideas for stories from other people's books. Now, your teachers, some of them are magnificent, some of them are very shifty individuals. Some teachers will say, no, don't nick other people's ideas. When you're writing stories, have ideas of your own. Other teachers who are devious and tricky call it magpieing. You know that phrase? Magpieing ideas. Basically, it's theft, but they're absolutely right. Because actually, there are only 7 stories in the world that you can tell. 7 basic stories. But those 7 stories can be told 1,000 million billion different ways. And that's what I love about writing as well. The fact that you can take other people's great ideas and make them your own. For example, a few years ago, I read this book. Do you know this? This is Danny, the Champion of the World by Roald Dahl. My favorite Roald Dahl book. But it's actually quite a simple little story, isn't it? It's about a boy who's got a dad and he thinks his dad's the best dad in the history of dads ever. And his dad's got a secret. Remember, when everyone else is asleep, his dad steals away into the farmer's field and he hunts down these birds called pheasants. Now, I didn't read this when I was your age. I wish I had. I read it when I was, nearly 40. And I read it with my son at bedtime. And I felt sad when we finished reading it because I thought I'll never again experience for the first time what it's like to read Danny Champion of the World. So I thought, well, I'll just write my own version. Because that's what you can do when you're a writer. You can take other people's ideas and make them your own. So I thought, okay, I need to give my dad a secret in my story. What would it be? What did I love doing when I was a kid, apart from football and frazzles? I love watching wrestling. Now, wrestling, I know, isn't like a proper sport. It's a bit daft and it's a bit fixed, but it's also funny and it's dramatic and it's a bit violent and it can be a bit gory and a bit scary at times. And it's almost like watching a really great film. It's so daft and brilliant. So I thought that's what I'll do. I'll set my story in the world of wrestling. I'll rewrite Danny Champion of the World, but in a lot more spandex. So instead of this book, I ended up with this book. Because this, instead of Danny, this is Jake. And Jake is your age and he goes to school just like yours. And this is his dad. This is George. And George, during the week, he knocks down buildings. He's a demolition man. But at the weekend, that's when it gets exciting because his dad doesn't knock down buildings anymore. He knocks down people. He's a wrestler. But nobody comes to watch him fight. 10, maybe 15 people turn up. And Jake feels sad about it. He wants his dad to be famous as a wrestler. So behind his dad's back, he enters him in a competition that he sees on the telly to find a new wrestling superstar. And the winner of that competition is going to be flown to Las Vegas to fight in front of 100,000 fans with billions watching around the world. They have to get in the ring and fight this guy. Let me find you his picture. Here he is. See this guy here? That is the Tsunami Terror. He's the most fearsome fighter the world has ever seen. And George has to get in the ring and fight him. So my question is, do you think George wins that fight? Interesting. Do you want to know if George wins that fight? Good. Then you have to go away and you have to read the book. Now, let me tell you about somewhere else that I get ideas from. Let me talk to you about this book. So this book came out last year, and it was my 20th book. It's called When the Sky Falls. And the reason I wrote this book, it comes back to this idea of being surrounded by stories, because the only reason I got the idea for this book was because one night I was sat round a campfire with a really good friend of mine called Pete. Now, Pete is in his 80s. He grew up during World War II. And Pete started telling me a story about his dad. Now, his dad wasn't allowed to be a soldier because he had asthma. So instead, he was part of Manchester's Home Guard. And every time the air raid siren rang in Manchester to let him know that the bombers were coming to drop their bombs on our cities, Pete's dad had one job, which was to grab a rifle and run as fast as he could to Manchester Zoo. And once he got there, he had to sit outside the lion's cage all night with his rifle trained between the bars of the lion's cage. Because if the Nazis dropped a bomb and it landed on the cage and it blew out the wall, that lion would get free. And that lion would be angry, confused, scared, and hungry. It could kill hundreds of people in minutes if it so chose. And so Pete's dad's job was to shoot that lion if it got free before it went on the rampage. And when he told me that story, it literally felt like I'd been plugged into the mains. It was like, wow, that is a story that I have got to write down. And so all I did was I asked myself that question again, that simple 2-word question. What if? What if that rifle didn't end up in the arms of a responsible adult now, but in the arms, of an angry 12-year-old boy called Joseph? And what if the animal inside the cage wasn't a lion anymore, but a gorilla? What if it was an angry, surly, aging silverback ape called Adonis? Because when the book starts, it's the winter of 1941. And by this point, 1.5 million children have been evacuated from the dangers of the city where the bombs are falling to the safety of the countryside. But I thought, what if? What if there was one boy whose behavior was so awful that his nan can't cope with him anymore? At the start of the story, we don't know where Joseph's mum is. We know his dad's away fighting, and we know that Joseph is angry and he makes his nan's life so difficult that she has no choice but to send him into the city instead of out of it, into the city where bombs are falling every night, because it's in the city that lives a lady who's prepared to take him in, who Joseph's never met before. And this woman is called Mrs. F. Now, Mrs. F doesn't seem to like anyone, let alone children. And Mrs. F runs the city's zoo. Yet the zoo is closed and the animals have nearly all gone, apart from Adonis. And when Adonis and Joseph meet each other, it's fair to say they do not get on. In fact, they pretty much detest each other. So once I've had a swig of tea, I'm going to read you a little bit where they meet for the first time. One sec. Oh. Right. So Joseph is in the zoo for the first time. And he's walking up and down in front of what he thinks is an empty cage. And he's got a stick in his hand. And he's rubbing this stick up and down the bars of the cage. And this is what happens. The echo of the metal was a pleasant noise. It was almost musical. And Joseph enjoyed how the stick bouncing off the bars sent shudders up his arms and across his chest. He reached the end of the cage, spun on his heels, and started to rewalk its length, repeating the process, ignoring Mrs. F's second warning. But as he reached the middle of the cage, he felt the world spin on its axis. There was no warning, no siren, just a tsunami of movement and an ear-splitting noise. Something crashed against the bars, ripping the branch from his fingers and sending him skittering backwards in shock. The chaos didn't stop. Whatever was inside the cage continued to throw itself against the bars, long, hairy arms reaching through, clawing for the boy as he scuttled away on his hands and knees. He was a monkey, he thought. No, it was bigger than that, way bigger, and angrier too. Angry enough to push his Mrs. F into action, moving towards the bars as Joseph dashed from them. Through gasping breaths, Joseph watched her walk slowly closer, arm outstretched, hand open and flat, but her head lowered, never once making contact with the monster inside. What was she doing? It'd rip her apart. She was mad. Mrs. F, though, appeared to be completely in control. As she neared the cage, her pace slowed further and she started to talk. Well, make noises, really. She reached the bars, a matter of inches from where the animal still rocked, and let herself slide down them. Slowly, with her head still down, she took a carrot from her pocket and pretended to eat it. The animal watched her. She pretended to take a second bite, and then a third, then almost in slow motion allowed her arm to reach through the bars, the beast's hand brushing hers as he gently took the carrot from her grasp. And then, nothing. The carrot lasted seconds, and before he'd even finished his final mouthful, the creature turned and stalked back into the shadows. Mrs. F stood too, shaking the stiffness from her knees. "Don't worry," she said. "Adonis takes some getting to know. You'll be cleaning his cage out in no time." What, you going there? Like, while he's in there too? Well, of course. I can hardly send him out for ice cream, can I? And he's not likely to shovel up his own muck if I leave him a spade. Sometimes I wait till he's asleep, and sometimes not. It's all about trust. Well, you won't catch me in there, Joseph mumbled. Mrs. F didn't hear him. "Lesson number 1, she said, always listen to Mrs. F. Lesson number 2, always listen to Mrs. F in the zoo, especially in the zoo. I'll tell you lesson number 3 as soon as I make it up." And with that, she strode on. Joseph's eyes didn't leave the cage. He still couldn't comprehend what he'd seen. All he knew was that Adonis, if that was actually the name of the creature, well, it clearly didn't like him very much, just like everyone else in his life. So they don't like each other. They don't get on. But my job as a writer is to change that. So by the end of the story, they are best mates. And by the end of the story, Joseph is stood outside Adonis's cage for some reason with a rifle in his hand. And bombs are falling. And one of them is going to drop on the cage. And one of them is going to make it so that Adonis escapes. And Joseph is going to be left with the biggest decision of his life, which is, could he and would he possibly pull the trigger on the one thing in his life that has truly loved him? And so that's the question for you. How many of you could do the same? If it came to it, if it would keep everyone else safe, how many of you could pull the trigger? And how many of you wouldn't? It doesn't matter whether your answer is yes or no. Well, the only thing that matters is that it makes you think about it. Because what that's doing, if you're thinking about it, then you're pretending what it's like to be that character. You're walking a mile in their shoes. And that's what good stories do. They make you imagine what life for someone else is like. Now, while I was writing When the Sky Falls, I came up with an idea for a second book about animals in World War II. Let me tell you what happened. While I was editing, my editor Charlie said to me, "Phil, you've given too many of these children pets. Don't forget what happened to animals at the start of World War II." And I didn't have a clue. Didn't have a clue what had happened to animals then. And so I went away and did some research, and I learned something called the Great Animal Massacre. And what it was, that as World War II was declared, the government sent this little booklet to every house in the country. It's not a very exciting book, is it? It's called Air Raid Precautions, Handbook number 12, Air Raid Precautions for Animals. And what it said in its 30 pages. Look, it's not very long. It said, it's not going to be safe for your pets. There's going to be bombs, flames, rubble, destruction, gas. There won't be enough food for the humans, let alone the animals. So unless you can evacuate your your animals in the same way that you would your children, you should have your animals put to sleep. You should have them killed. And when you open this story, this little book, it's quite scary because the first thing you see is this advert for a pistol, the Cash Captive Bolt pistol, and this is the pistol they were saying you should buy to kill your pet. And as you open it up and flip through inside, you'll find pages like this with diagrams showing you where to put the pistol in order to kill your animal in the most painless way. And that terrified me and scared me because what I realized was that, as I did the research, was that in 1 month, September 1939, 750,000 animals were killed. They were shot. They were put to sleep. And if you read about World War II, you'll learn that about 375,000 British soldiers died during the war. So that means that double the number of animals died in just 1 month. And that again made me, as a writer, just say, what if? What if there was one boy, where is he? There he is, who said no? Because when this book starts, it's the summer of 1939, and Noah here, his dad's just joined up to be a soldier and he's marching off to war. And as his dad leaves, Noah's dad asks him to do something for him. He says, Noah, stay out of trouble. Noah's always in trouble. Stay out of trouble, look after your mother, and whatever you do, keep the dog safe. Win is their dog, their beautiful family dog. And Dad says, if you can keep the dog safe, son, then I'll be safe too. Bullets won't touch me. It'll be like I'm bulletproof. And Dad marches off to war. 2 weeks later, war is declared. And this book gets posted through Noah's letterbox. And his mum turns around and says, I'm sorry, Noah, but we're going to have Win put to sleep. And to Win, that's horrific. Because that means that he can't keep his dad safe. Because his dad says, if the dog's not safe, then I'm not safe. And Noah's terrified that his dad won't come back alive. So Noah hatches a plan. Him and his mate Clem and the local sort of school bully, Big Col, they round up as many animals as they can. They round up cats and dogs and rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, birds. Someone ties a donkey up to their boat that's wearing a sun hat. Big Col turns up with his pet, and it turns out he's got a 20-foot python in a sack called Delilah that he keeps in the airing cupboard. And they hide them all on board Noah's dad's boat. Now, I say it's a boat. It's more of a kind of a rusty bathtub, to be honest. It's not very seaworthy. But they decide they're going to sail it down the River Thames because somewhere downriver lives a duchess called Lady Nina Douglas Hamilton. And she was a real person. She lived. And when the government sent that booklet out, she put a statement in the newspapers that said, don't have your animals put to sleep. Bring them to me. Bring them to my country estate, and I will keep them safe for you until the war is over. So Noah and his pals decide that's what they're going to do. The only two problems is one, they don't really know where she lives. And secondly, is that the boat is not safe. In fact, after just over a day of sailing it down the River Thames, it overheats to such a dramatic extent that it catches fire. And Noah has to pull it over to the riverbank and safely get all the animals onto the riverbank. And they manage it. But as they stand there and watch his dad's boat burn, they realise there's still one animal left on board. It's Big Col Snake, Delilah. It's in a sack on the deck as the boat burns around it. And I thought I would read you what happened next. So Noah has run back on board. At that moment, surrounded by fire and smoke and the remains of his dad's beloved boat, Noah wondered if his impetuousness had finally caught up with him. The power of the flames seemed to be shriveling his skin, and no matter which way he moved, it worsened. The smoke, too, was thick and acrid, making him cough so hard he thought his lungs would burst. Delilah, he yelled, though he had no idea why. The snake was hardly likely to call back. In fact, he only found the sack by accident, tripping over it as he groped instinctively. And as his feet made contact with it, he felt the lump inside kick back. Was it trying to bite him? The next problem was how to get both the sack and himself off the boat. The flames were incessant now, so high and vicious that Noah had no idea which way the gangplank lay. He strained into the fire, trying to get a view of something, anything that would offer him help, but it was fruitless. All he knew was that he was surrounded, and the only thing he could do was take a guess and hope for the best. As he tried to lift the sack, he realized the next of his problems. It was too heavy. He tried again and again and again, but no matter how hard he tried, he simply couldn't get it past his knees, couldn't get the leverage he needed to get the sack onto his back. Once more, he thought, one more try. But as he strained, a new flame erupted from below deck, throwing Noah onto his front and onto the sack, causing Delilah to hiss viciously through it. Noah screamed. He couldn't help it. How long did he have? It wouldn't be long. It could be seconds now. So if he was going to do it, it had to be now. Now. He pulled himself to his feet and planted them either side of the sack. Where the idea had come from, he wasn't sure. He thinks he'd seen athletes do it on the cinema newsreel. There are Scottish hammer throwers, veins practically exploding from their necks as they cast a lump of metal further than was humanly possible. He didn't even have to throw the sack that far. All he had to do was clear the flames. He could do this, he had to. So with every bit of strength he had, he gripped the sack and, ignoring the flames and sparks nipping at his skin, he hauled it to shin level and he started to spin. It wasn't easy. He was tired and dizzy and flustered, and there was precious little space on deck that wasn't already alight. His lungs burned, as did his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't, he daren't, and all he could do was build every bit of momentum he had until, dervish-like, he spun so hard that his arms and the sack were at a right angle to his body. He'd no idea if he had enough momentum, not to mention strength, to do what he needed to do. He had no idea if Delilah could possibly survive the shock. But all he was doing was simply giving the animal the best chance of survival he could. So this was it, the moment. Do or die. And with one final spin and a cry that rumbled deep from the depths of him, Noah let go. And the sack and Delilah went flying. And if you want to know whether Delilah made it, you will have to read on. So let's summarize what we have learned this morning. Firstly, most importantly, enjoy your frazzles, but eat them responsibly. I think 4 bags a day is probably enough. Don't walk down the street every day with your phone out. Put your phone in your pocket every day. I promise you will spot stories waiting for you to write down. Find that one book. For me, it was Holes. It doesn't even have to be a novel. It could be a magazine, a comic, an audio story, anything that allows you to live someone else's life. And remember, as a writer, the only things you need to remember is it's playtime. There's nowhere you can't go, and there's nothing you can't do, and there's no world you can't create. And finally, the only question you ever have to ask as a writer is what if? And with that, I'll happily take any questions if you might have them.
I've got a first question.
Great.
Yeah, I want to know what those 7, you said there were 7 stories. With only 7 stories. What were those 7? What are those?
Do you know what? I can't remember all of them, but what I do know is, the best example I always give is if you think about Shakespeare, if you think about Romeo and Juliet, right? Mm-hmm. Romeo and Juliet is a play about a boy who falls in love with a girl, and he shouldn't fall in love with her, and she shouldn't fall in love with him because they come from warring families. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really what that story is about. And then if you fast forward about 300 years, let me just get it off my shelf. A book came out, and it's this book here. It's called Noughts and Crosses by Mallory.
Yes.
And this story is about a boy who falls in love with a girl, and he shouldn't fall in love with her because they come from warring families. The only thing that Mallory does differently is that she sets it in modern times, for starters, but also she starts to play with race. She talks about racism because, as we know, throughout the centuries, in so many countries around the world, it has been white people that have been racist and oppressive towards people of colour. And what Mallory does is she just flips that on its head. Do you know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
now it's not black people who are downtrodden and treated badly, it's the other way around. So all that Mallory does is retell the Romeo and Juliet story, but she does it cleverly by playing with race. And I love that. I love that thing that it's basically just Romeo and Juliet. Or, for example, at the cinema last year, there was a really successful film called West Side Story. And all West Side Story is Romeo and Juliet retold, but in a different time period. It's clever. You can take that story. It's
Yeah.
like, or for example, there's a really famous book called Skellig
Mm-hmm.
by David Almond about a boy who finds like a being living down in the shed at the bottom of the garden. And then, but about 30 years before that, there was a book called Stig of the Dump by Clive Kemp. And that's about a boy who finds a caveman living down in the quarry. It's, in essence, it's the same story, but told in a different way.
Mm.
But I'm not quite sure what all 7 of them are. I really should research that. But I'm told time and again there are.
I shall look it up. I shall definitely look it up. Can we talk a bit about your covers?
Yeah.
About the covers. How much input do you have to that?
Yeah, but Anderson Press, who were my publisher, were really lovely. So they found this illustrator called Levente, who I think can't remember where he lives, Poland. I think he's Polish. And they said, "Do you like his work?" And I said, "Yeah, I think it's great." And then they said, "Oh, well, we think we might do this, and we might do this." So they talk to you constantly, and then he'll do like rough drawings, and then you get to see them, and you get to sort of offer any sort of thoughts you might have. I'll show you if you want to see. I can show you some other covers from around the world as well. Do you want to see that? Just knock me books off the shelf. So, for example, this is the Greek version of When the Sky Falls, and they used Levente's cover and just changed the title. Yeah, obviously it's just in Greek. However, in France, they went for something completely different, a completely different art style. Really rather lovely. And if you look carefully, you can see the clouds here. It's shaped like Adonis.
Yeah.
And then in America, they went for something completely different. Something that feels almost a bit Disney, a bit almost kind of Disney-esque. So it's really interesting how different countries see covers in different ways.
And they must know what sort of cover will attract their readers. So yeah, absolutely. What about the titles, Phil? Were they always called by those titles?
So if you look inside When the Sky Falls, if you look on what is called the title page, which is this page here, you can see very clearly it says When the Sky Falls. And then underneath it, there's a bracket and it says, or A is for Adonis. And when I was writing it for the first time, it wasn't called When the Sky Falls. It was called A is for Adonis. But my publisher said, we don't think that's very good. So we want to change it. And I was really happy because I really liked When the Sky Falls, but I wanted there to be mention of the original title. So we slid it on the title page as well.
Sneaky. A lot of people don't get that. They have to go with what the publisher says, and they maybe don't like it when it finishes.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the attention to detail in your books and the dialogue? Talk about your characters. How do you get inside the head of those characters? How do you get those characters? Where do they come from?
They come from Joseph, I think, is based on a lot of the young men that I was lucky enough to work with. When I left university, I worked in children's homes. I looked after boys and girls that weren't allowed to live with their parents because their parents weren't very well. And as a result, a lot of those kids were quite angry, because they wanted to live with their mum and dad, and they were angry at the mum and dad for not being well enough to look after them, and they were angry at us because they thought we were taking them away from their parents. And so people like Joseph, characters like Joseph, are often based on those young people because they were angry for a reason. Do you know what I mean? Nobody's angry for no reason. There's always reasons why people feel like they do. So I always find it really interesting to try and understand why people feel like that. So yeah.
So do you see yourself in either Noah or Joseph or Big Cog?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not a very angry person, but I think a lot of the feelings that Joseph has in that book were feelings that I'd had, and that's a good thing about writing, is it allows you to take difficult things that you might be going through in your life and having somewhere really safe to put them. There's nothing safer than being able to put your feelings inside another character, inside a story that's made up. And Noah, in While the Storm Rages, I think Noah's a bit of wish fulfillment, really, because I'd like to be as daring as Noah. Do you know what I mean? But I'm a bit of a scaredy cat, I think. So, yeah, I think I'd quite like to be him rather than being like him.
And what about the relationship between him and Clem? I like the relationship between him and Clem. She's when the newspaper comes out, he's young for his age, but she is intelligent. I love that character. I love Clem.
Yeah, it seems to have been with both these books. It seems to have sort of happened upon quite strong young female characters. And I just like that. Boys so often think they know everything. Do you know what I mean? I've got 3 kids, and our eldest, Albie, he thinks he knows everything more than his sister Elsie, who's 2 years younger than him. And he doesn't by any stretch. So I quite like the idea of putting the boys firmly in the place. In both of these books, it's often either Sid or Clem who get the lads out of trouble. Do you know what I mean? They're far smarter.
So is Clem based on your daughter?
She probably is a little bit. Yeah, she probably is.
How long did it take to write While the Storm Rages?
So the first sort of version of it that I wrote probably took me about 6 months. If I'm writing a full length novel, I always try and get it written in about 6 months, and then that leaves me another 6 months to edit it. Because with both these books, we needed to rewrite it several times. Do you know what I mean? The first time I wrote it, it wasn't good enough. The story wasn't strong enough. The characters didn't feel real enough. So yeah, that 12 months allows me just to make sure that I've got it into as good a state as I can.
Do you think by living with your characters for 12 months, that's why your writing is so successful? Because when the children are on the boat and the things that they go through, I've always got to be really careful not to say anything, because I don't want to. I want everybody to read it, but I don't want to spoil it. But I did actually feel as though I could feel empathy for them. I knew how they felt. Noah sets off as a bit of a daredevil. He's a bit, yeah, we can do this. Everything will be okay. And then you see his character, as reality starts to dawn on him, you see, oh my goodness, what have I done? And he keeps turning a bit more to Clem, and the way he stands up to Big Colin, his character changes. But I felt as though I was on that journey with him. And does that come from the fact that you're living with your book and you're changing things and you're editing?
I think so, because I try, when I'm writing a first draft, I try and write a bit every day, even if it's just for a few minutes. Do you know what I mean? So when you spend that much time with someone, they become really important to you, and I can't wait to get back to them. Do you know what I mean? The best part of my day is when I sit down and open my laptop and start to write, because it's like you get to hang out with your friends. But you also have to do awful things to your characters as well. You've got to really love them, but you've got to make really bad stuff happen to them, because it's only by making bad stuff happen to them that you make their story dramatic, and that's what makes your readers keep coming back for more.
How much do you think fiction plays a role in educating?
Yeah, I mean, I don't write to educate. I think I write to entertain. Do you know what I mean? It's amazing, right? This last year has been the single biggest thing with when the Skyfall's doing well, is that teachers have started using it in class and they're reading it to students. And that's brilliant. It is. It's really humbling, but it's not the reason I wrote it. I wrote it because I wanted to go on that adventure. And literally, if I hadn't written these books, those stories, it feels like it would have burnt a hole in me. Do you know what I mean? It feels like it's really like an urgent thing that I need to do.
And I think that's why it's so successful. But we've got teachers bringing classes and children into libraries all the time, and they talk about books that they can use to bring periods of life from history to bring that history to life. Sorry, and that I think that's why I recommend your books to teachers, because it puts the children in the right place. It's not something being told to them. It's something that they can go along with. They become part of it. They feel like the characters do, and you know, I can't imagine anybody pushing a leaflet through anybody's door now and saying you've got to have all your pets put to sleep. I'm sure there'd be a lot more people like Noah who just refused to do as he was told.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did regret it as well. You know, because for many months when war broke out, the bombs didn't come, not immediately, and a lot of people regretted that.
What else was I going to ask you? Oh, I know. You recently recorded, I believe you recorded While the Storm Rages as an audio. What was that like?
I've done both of them. Yeah, I've recorded both of these two as audiobooks. It was one of the most exciting things I've ever done. Do you know what I mean? It was funny because you go and sit in this tiny little soundproofed room that's no bigger than kind of a broom closet. And you've got an iPad in front of you with the story on and a big microphone sat in front of you. And through a window just to this side, there's a man or a lady who are listening to you. And if they stop you, if you make a mistake or if you go too quick or too slow. And I sat there for 2 days and just read my own book aloud. And it was lovely. I had a really nice time. I sat there, drank tea and I read my book. It was brilliant.
Do you plan then when you write your books, do you start off with a beginning, a middle and an end? Or does it just grow organically?
Yeah, it very much just grows. I mean, often I have a basic idea for the start. Sometimes I have a start and an end. I never have a start, a middle, and an end. For me, the exciting bit is working out what I'm going to do as I'm writing it, because what that means is that I'm its first reader. Do you know what I mean? I'm the writer, but I'm also the first reader, and that I find that really exciting. I find that really, it gets my heart racing. I love it.
What else was I going to say? Yeah, it's sometimes when I'm reading a book, I read the beginning and it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, but it doesn't seem to have an organic end to it. Very often books end abruptly or whatever, and I always think the ending must be very difficult for somebody to write, but yours flow all the way through. And another thing, if I was going to write a book, it would be, hello, good morning, this happens, goodbye. It's the way that you slow the whole thing down so that you take the reader on the journey.
It's like a roller coaster, isn't it? It's like the best roller coasters don't all travel at the same speed all the way through the ride. Do you know what I mean?
Very clever. Yes, I do.
Often roller coasters will have quick bits and then it'll slow down a little bit and then quickly you'll accelerate again and then it'll turn you on your head and then there's a quiet bit. But it always tries to end with an exciting bit as well. So I think it's worth thinking about it, either as a roller coaster or as a succession of like mountain tops. Do you know what I mean? Those are good shapes for sort of pacing a story.
You've got a very vivid imagination that comes through very, very clearly in all your books.
Thank you.
So what's next then? Film, TV?
Well, that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
It would.
I'm writing a third and final World War II animal story.
Right.
But this time it's about a dog, a stray dog, a cat who he hates, and a carrier pigeon who thinks he's a soldier. And the difference with this story is they can all talk to each other. These are sort of talking animals. The animals are the heroes, so the animals can converse with each other, and they have to go on a big sort of cross-country journey to be reunited with this little girl that they've lost. So that's called Until the Road Ends, and that'll be out.
When is that coming out?
June next year, if I can get it written in time.
Right, so it's back to the drawing board then. Back to your day job.
Yeah.
I think we're just about coming to the end of our hour. I've got lots more questions I could ask you, but I haven't. I'm not allowed to do that because we're coming up to the hour. So I will say thank you so very, very much for coming along today and telling us about your journey, and thank you for producing such wonderful books and bringing a joy of reading to all our middle grade readers. Can I just ask, will you stay with us while I tell people what's coming up next?
Absolutely.
And then we'll we'll have a chat in the studio afterwards, if that's okay with you. So don't forget to visit Phil's website. Let me just find this, because there's all sorts of good stuff on here. Just excuse me, there. That is Phil's website. So do go and have a look at him on there. And the other thing that I would say is to follow Phil on Twitter and on Instagram. Okay, that's my plug for your stuff there. Okay, so going back to sorry, I've got things coming up. Going back to my notes, what's coming up next? So our next Library Adventures Live. Our next Library Adventures Live will be next Tuesday, and this will be the 28th of June at 11 o'clock. Now, this will be the much-loved children's author and illustrator, Minnie Gray. And Minnie will be sharing her amazing new book, The Greatest Show on Earth. The session is sure to be a feast for the eyes and the ears, as Minnie takes us on her journey of how she develops her ideas and guides through her artistic challenge. So I'll take that off now there. So so don't forget to come and see us next week. We'll just bring Phil back in there to say a final goodbye and a thank you so much for today's session. And I wish you all success with your work in the future. And I think that's just about it from me to say goodbye until our next session of Library Adventures Live. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks, Phil.